we will start because the minister has a very tight schedule. So let me first welcome him here on behalf of SIPA, Columbia Law School, and everybody else, business school, everybody, because he's a scarce, precious resource. I should say that I've known him for about 30 years. He's not half as old as I am, so I started early getting to know him. And he's really one of the most important figures on the Indian landscape. And he's right in the middle of the environmental negotiations on Copenhagen. So that is actually I hope we'll get to hear from him about what he calls the Indian road to Copenhagen. And that will give us some insight into where India is vis-a-vis US and EU and so on and so forth. Maybe even Japan, I don't know. But definitely, let me just say that the whole quality of the environmental ministers is moving up. Like we have Stephen Chu here, and Jairam Ramesh is very, very modest, but he's actually taken his mechanical engineering degree from IIT in Bombay. And for those of you who don't know what Indian Institutes of Technology are, they're among the world-class institutions, and I remember a 60-minute talk or an interview with a whole lot of kids who had applied for the exam to get into, and they were asked on 60 Minutes, what will you do if you don't get into IIT? And then two of them said, we would then settle for MIT or Caltech. So I mean, that's the kind of universities you're dealing with, and that he's one of the early brilliant products. And then he also went to MIT, as it happened, for a year. And then he also went to Carnegie Mellon to do PPM. So those of you who are doing PEPM or MPA programs would have something in common with him. He's also, I should say that he's also a very influential figure. He was one of the prominent reformers, along with the Prime Minister, early on. And the reforms were practically launched, and he certainly shares credit with the Prime Minister and a couple of other advisors. But then later on, he has also been close to Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, which is a little bit on the right, on the left of the, but we don't have time to go into. I think it's just a matter of sequencing. The major reforms of the conventional sort have gone through. Now we're in the second phase of reforms, and that's where he's again extremely close to designing those, and I think that's very important. Third, he's also a fantastically witty character, and I'll just tell you a story about how Senator Moynihan, when he was ambassador to India, he used to get very upset with us Indians, and I could see that, because the members of parliament during the day would denounce the United States in the parliament. In the evening, they would go and see him and say, can you get my son admitted to Harvard? So he could not digest this dissonance of behavior. But Jairam Ramesh made the same point in a much more brilliant way, because he wrote a little leaf pamphlet which said, Yankee, go home, but take me with you. So we've known each other for years, and we always exchanging such remarks and so on. So I think really, he's a guy, because of his background, his articulation, his training, his importance in politics, and now he's a key figure in the India-US dialogue. So it's really a privilege to him. He's someone who, when he talks, we need to listen. So now I ask you to do so.
Thank you, Professor Bhagwati. An invitation from Jagdish is very hard to resist. He's very persistent, and he badgered me with a lot of emails when he got to know that I'm coming here. And he was very insistent that I come and speak to this audience. And, of course, Professor Bhagwati is well known, not only in America, but also in India, because he's one of those who did not discover the value of economic reforms in the 90s. He had started writing about them in the early 70s. And in many ways, he's a guru of sorts to all those of us who participated in this transformation in Indian economic policy in the 1990s. And I certainly know for a fact that our Prime Minister and he go back long, long way back to Cambridge days. And he and Professor T.N. Srinivasan both had a very profound impact on the early design of our reforms program in 1991 and 1992. I thought I'll make this session very interactive. So rather than give you a long spiel on what India's road to Copenhagen is, just make a couple of introductory remarks and then throw it open for questions. I think much more value to responding to your queries and your doubts. Since India is now portrayed as a renegade, according to one senator, according to somebody else, we are intransigent. And the third has us as the bottleneck or the stumbling block to a grand agreement at Copenhagen. So I'd like to address some of these appellations that are thrown at us nowadays. And for a country that accounts for less than 5% of world greenhouse gas emissions, that's really a remarkable achievement. To be called the stumbling block for a grand agreement, and to be called the primary reason why the United States should not be part of any agreement. So it really beats my reasoning, but let me try to understand and share with you where we are coming from. What I'll do is I'll just give you a broad overview of India's position on the world greenhouse gas emissions scene. I'll talk about our negotiating position. And those of you who've been following the Indian press, last couple of days, there's been a slight nuanced shift in our position. And I'll take this opportunity of talking about that as well. Well, the numbers are all well known to all of you. India, with 16% of the world's population, accounts for about 4.5% of world greenhouse gas emissions. China, with about 17% of the world's population, now accounts for about 23% of world greenhouse gas emissions. And the United States, with about 5% of the world's population, accounts for about 22% of world greenhouse gas emissions. India is number 5. China, the USA, the EU, Russia, and India. And we have done some modeling exercises, the results of which I'm carrying with me, but they're all available on our website, and those of you who are interested can just go to our website. It's a very rich website in content. And what we have done is we have just recently, 2 weeks ago, looked at alternative scenarios of growth for the year 2020 and 2030. I'm one of those who believe that to be credible, we should make commitments in 2020 and 2030, not like the current scenario where everybody is busy trying to position himself or herself for 2050, knowing fully well that none of us are going to be around then. So you can make any commitment you want for 2050, you're not going to be held accountable. So I would like to make something for 2020 and 2030 and be held accountable for that. We have done these exercises, and even under the most aggressive of growth scenarios, which is 8 to 8.5% growth of GDP per year, our per capita emissions of greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 is around 2 to 2.5 tons per capita of CO2 equivalent, and by 2030 there would be between 3 to 3.5 tons per capita of CO2 equivalent. Now, our Prime Minister has already enumerated what is now come to be called the Singh principle, which is that India's per capita emissions at all points of time will always be below the per capita emissions of the developed world. Now, I know that many people in the world think that per capita is a very convenient argument for India, but Indians, let me assure you, did not invent per capita. It is there in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was signed in Rio in 1992. And per capita, as the two distinguished economists will undoubtedly know better than me, remains the only equitable way of ensuring distributional equity. So this is not some Indian invention in some Upanishads that we came up with per capita. So on a per capita basis, our Prime Minister has always said that we will be below the per capita emissions of the developed world. And as I said, our calculations, our modeling, our simulations show that we would be somewhere around 2 to 2.5 tons per capita by 2020 of CO2 equivalent, and about 3 to 3.5 tons per capita of CO2 equivalent by 2030. And this is much, much below the developed world per capita emissions. I say these numbers because many numbers get thrown out in the international media on India, and I think it's important to place this in its proper perspective. And as I said, these modeling exercises are available. We've got about 4 or 5 different models, research institutions that have worked on this. They've been peer-reviewed, and these are available for public debate and criticism people may have. But under the most aggressive of assumptions, as I mentioned, we don't cross 3.5 tons per capita. Now, even though we are not a major greenhouse gas emitter, both in absolute terms and in per capita terms, and even though we will not be a major greenhouse gas emitter in per capita terms, but we will be an important greenhouse gas emitter in absolute terms, India is very concerned about climate change. And the reason why we are concerned about climate change, apart from the fact that our culture and our society is climate influenced, what would be Bollywood films without rains, where the hero and the heroine have a spot of enjoyment? The fact of the matter is that if you look at the variations in GDP growth in the last 50 years, 40 to 45% of the annual variations in GDP growth have come from variations in rainfall alone. Rainfall continues to be the single most important driver of annual variations in GDP growth. And this is even after accounting for the structural transformation that has taken place in the Indian economy. So we are deeply conscious of the local impacts of global warming, whether it relates to the frequency of extreme events like rainfall failure or excess rainfall, whether it relates to increase in mean sea levels, which will affect the entire peninsular India and the livelihoods of almost 15 million fishermen and their families, or if as it relates to the adverse behavior on the Himalayan glaciers, which will have a multiplier effect on the water security for about 1 billion people living on the Ganges, Brahmaputra basins. So India is a climate-dependent society. It's a climate-dependent economy, in spite of all its great successes in modern economy. And therefore, we are deeply concerned, and we have to be deeply concerned. It's not just looking at per capita emissions or global emissions. It's the fact that any perturbation in international climate which will have an effect on our rainfall or mean sea levels or the receding of the glaciers will have a profound impact on livelihoods in our country. So we come to Copenhagen, our engagement in the Copenhagen process proceeds from this realization that we have to be part of a solution. We may not have been the creators of the problem, but we have to be part of the solution, because an agreement at Copenhagen is perhaps, a lack of an agreement may not be suicidal for the US, but for a country like India, it's important, it's absolutely critical to have an agreement at Copenhagen. And this is the message that I've been trying to convey, both domestically and internationally, that we are proactive, we are engaging the world community proactively, and we want to be constructive in the approach to Copenhagen. And in keeping with this spirit of constructive engagement, India has actually made 12 specific proposals on the Copenhagen process. And this again is on our website, and I've got a document which I can share with Professor Bhagwati for those of you who are interested. And these are very concrete proposals in the area of technology, in the area of finance, in the area of forestry. I'll come to this a little later. So we have actually made a number of specific suggestions to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to make an agreement at Copenhagen possible. Now, we also have a National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was unveiled last year. This National Action Plan also is in the public domain. And this National Action Plan is a mix of adaptation measures to climate change, and also has a small but important component of mitigation interventions as well. So we have a National Action Plan, and we are proceeding along this National Action Plan. And what we are currently engaged in with the international community is discussions with all our important partners to convert our commitments that have been made in the National Action Plan to some international agreement which will get fashioned at Copenhagen. Now, Copenhagen itself, my own view is that the perfect should not become the enemy of the good. And we should try to get a good agreement, the building blocks of which are already available with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and use the Copenhagen process of getting a series of small agreements on less contentious issues to build that as a starting point for a much ambitious agreement. Now, I know there are a number of ideas that are on the table. Professor Bhagwati himself has put forward some ideas. Dr. Panagaria has. Tom Schelling, Michael Spence, Jeff Sachs, Nick Stern. Many economists have suggested different formulae, different proposals. But all these proposals, if you see all these proposals that are on the table, what is common is an acceptance of the fact that without credible and substantial emission responsibility commitments being undertaken by the developed world, no agreement at Copenhagen is going to be possible. Somehow that argument has just been lost sight of in the desire to paint countries like India and China to be alibis for inaction on your own front. I think there is a wide consensus today amongst economists, amongst people who are dealing with this field, that without a very substantial commitment on emission reductions, mitigation reductions by the developed world, we are not going to be able to make progress at Copenhagen. Now, India, along with China, South Africa, and Brazil, has made a concrete proposal as part of the negotiating process, a 40% cut by the developed world by 2020 with 1990 reference levels. This is very important because goalposts keep changing in this debate. It's important to keep the goalpost, and this is not my goalpost. It's a goalpost that was accepted as part of the Kyoto process, as part of the Kyoto Protocol. So what we are saying is, if there is a demonstration to cut emissions by 2020 by 40%, that precise number can be argued. We have given a 40% proposal with 1990 reference levels. We can then begin to talk about a good agreement at Copenhagen. Now, if this were not possible, if substantial emission reduction requirements and cuts are not going to be taken by the developed world for more reasons than one, then is it possible to conceive of an agreement at Copenhagen? So I think a very good agreement would be had if we have a consensus on the 1990 reference year. We also have a consensus on the 2020 target year and not put it off to 2050, for which we will not be held accountable. And if there is a substantial emission reduction cut taken by the developed world, and I would define substantial as anywhere between 25% to 40%. Now, if this were not possible, what is a second best solution at Copenhagen? And I have suggested to my counterparts in many countries, and we're going to be having a dialogue over the weekend as part of the Greenland process. This is a Greenland dialogue being held in upstate New York, hosted by Denmark. And I've suggested to my colleagues, and we'll be discussing this, that I see three very important elements, what I would call low-hanging fruit, which can be plucked at Copenhagen. And one of the things that we should do at Copenhagen is not follow the single undertaking approach of the WTO. If you follow the single undertaking approach of the WTO, Copenhagen is not going to make any progress. As you know, the single undertaking process means you have an agreement on everything. Everybody agrees on everything, and only then you have an agreement. I think this is a recipe for disaster at Copenhagen. I think it's important for us to focus on what is achievable at Copenhagen. And I have suggested that there are three specific areas, and I see this as three specific areas in which today there is broad consensus in the international community. First, on the role of forestry. Forests are absolutely critical to any GHG, greenhouse gas mitigation strategy, because they are a large carbon sink, carbon sequestration. This is the most effective mode of carbon sequestration. Now here, again, India has made a concrete proposal to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I'm pleased that we were the first country to do so. Now, Brazil and Indonesia are countries that are worried about deforestation. India, on the other hand, is one of the few countries in the world which is actually in the business of reforestation. We're adding about 500,000 to 1 million hectares per year of forest and tree cover. Not as good as China, but still very, very substantial. India and China are two of the few countries in the world that are actually adding to forest and tree cover. And we have estimated, and this is a study that was done recently, and this too is available on the website to those of you who are interested, we have estimated that 10% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions is neutralized by the 65 million hectares of forest cover that we have in our country, roughly the size of Texas. Now, this is a very important area for international agreement. And I think everybody recognizes this. The US recognizes this. The developing world recognizes this. And I think there is a broad consensus that forestry is one important ecologically sustainable way of creating a carbon sink. Now, if that agreement is there, then I think we should clinch an international agreement at Copenhagen on the carbon sequestration through forests, and actually then building it as part of an agreement and then assigning the credits to the different countries. A second area in which I think we need or we could reach an agreement is the CDM extension. As you know, the Clean Development Mechanism was introduced as part of the Kyoto Protocol. My NGO friends in India are against the CDM because they feel that CDM is a way of assuaging, sort of the guilt conscience of the developed world is assuaged by emitting CO2 in your country and then solving that problem by going and buying the credit in developing countries. This is the essence of the CDM. It was a Brazilian innovation. So you don't actually mitigate CO2 in the US. The US company, like maybe GE or GM or whatever it is, they continue to pour out CO2, but then they find some wind energy project or a solar project or a forestry project or a hydro project in some developing world. They support it with technology and finance, mostly finance. They get what is called the carbon emission requirement, the credits, and then that goes to the credit of the country for its mitigation responsibilities. This is called the Clean Development Mechanism. And India is one of the countries that has actually benefited very substantially between 2002 to 2000, once it started, up to the year 2012. We almost would have got about $6 billion by way of foreign direct investment into the CDM projects. And again, we have estimated that once all the CDM projects are implemented, roughly 10 to 12% of our annual greenhouse emissions gets neutralized. So on CDM, I think, again, most countries are in agreement that this is a good market-based intervention. It's philosophically not acceptable to many people, but it's a good market-based intervention. And it enables developing countries to get access to resources. It also helps the developed world to cut down on their mitigations without substantially affecting their lifestyles. So I think a second relatively low-hanging fruit is the international agreement to continue the clean development mechanism beyond 2012-2013. And a third area where I think an international agreement is possible is in the area of technology sharing, in specific areas relating to climate change, whether it relates to solar energy, whether it relates to wind, whether it relates to clean coal, whether it relates to biomass. We have today a large variety of models of international technology cooperation. And I'm not advocating the 60s or the 70s model of technology cooperation because I know the appetite for doing anything in the public domain in the United States has virtually vanished. But if you look back and ask yourself, how did the Green Revolution come about? The Green Revolution came about because of a very substantial investment in international technology cooperation in the public domain. And I know the public domain now is a bad word in many countries, and the buzzword is public-private partnership. So it is possible to have an architecture of international cooperation in which there is considerable public-private partnership. And I can give you an example. The Bill Gates Foundation has done the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. The ERV initiative is a good example of a public-private partnership. We have an International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology in India, which is funded by the Italian government and a variety of European governments to develop vaccines for malaria. That's a good example of public-private partnership in international technology collaboration. So these three elements, the building blocks of a bigger agreement that could emerge in Copenhagen too, because I'm sure Denmark wants to have its place in history and wants to be the place where this great agreement on climate change was finally clinched. So maybe in Copenhagen 2 you may have this great agreement, but in Copenhagen 1, if you have an agreement on forestry, if you have an agreement on the extension of the clean development mechanism, and if you have an agreement on an international technology cooperation in specific areas in a public-private mode, I think we would have made very substantial progress as far as international agreements are concerned. Finally, let me talk about what is the slight shift, perceived shift that has come about in India's position. Ever since I came to this job on the 29th of May, I have been very concerned that unfairly India has been painted in negative light. And as I said, we certainly don't deserve that. We work hard for many of our dubious achievements, but this is the one for which we really have got a bum rap. And I asked myself, what is it that we can do to convey to the world in a much more aggressive and bold manner that we mean business? And what we are now doing is that India is telling the world, so far we have been telling you we will do adaptation, you have to do mitigation. Now I am telling the world, because climate change is important for me, it is important for me to moderate the growth in greenhouse gas emissions. I am prepared to take on voluntarily, unilaterally, mitigation actions as part of a domestic legislative agenda. It's very important. I'm not making an international commitment because I believe an international commitment, any international commitment that we make must be preceded by hard, demonstrable action by the developed world with 2020 as the target year and 1990 as a reference year. But what I'm telling the world and what I'm telling my own people is, look, there are some areas where we have to move and move aggressively, not in a philosophical manner, but in a specific target-oriented manner. That will help us. It will help us to manage the greenhouse gas emissions, and it will not hurt us as far as our GDP growth and energy consumption is concerned. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I have in mind. For example, we have decided that we will introduce mandatory fuel efficiency standards by 2011. I'm not making an international commitment, but I'm making a domestic commitment. And we are going to introduce legislation to ensure that we will have mandatory fuel efficiency standards by 2011. Now, this will not be California-type efficiency standards, which, as you know, the California actually regulates the CO2 emissions. This would be the non-California American approach. In many areas, California is different from the United States. So we'll add fuel efficiency standards also, the US or the Italian or the Japanese or the UK one. So we have said that we will have mandatory fuel efficiency standards by 2011. This is very important because today the transportation sector accounts for something like 15% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2030, it's estimated to account for something like 25 to 30% of our emissions. This is an example of what I mean as a voluntary action that we are committing. And committing not because I'm in power, but committing by law in Parliament, which will ensure that whichever the government is in power, there'll be a commitment to it. And by and large, Indian democracy, for all its idiosyncrasies, one thing that has been very clear, no government has actually changed legislation. We threaten to change legislation when we are in power, when we are out of power. But when we come to power, we continue with that legislation. Because this is based on the old parliamentary principle on where you stand depends on where you sit. So, when we are out of power, we say that we will remove this legislation. But when we come to power, we actually continue with it. And examples are replete with this. The second area, which I've talked about, is renewables. Today, everybody is saying that, China is becoming the great renewable capital of the world. Fact of the matter is that 8% of India's electricity supply today comes from renewable energy. Today, I'm not talking of 2020, I'm talking of 2009. 8% of our electricity generating capacity comes from renewables. And we define renewables very honestly. We don't include hydel as renewable energy. Like many countries include hydropower as renewable energy and exaggerate the importance of renewables. So what we are saying is by the year 2020 or 2030, this 8% could go on, we could take 20%. We could take on a target of 20%. A third area that we have talked about is to say that since coal is a very important energy resource for India, it will be the major energy resource for India. We could take on a commitment by saying that again by the year 2020 or 2030, 50% of all coal-based power generation would be based on clean coal technology. A fourth area that I've spoken on is agriculture, and said that we could say, as part of a domestic legislation, that X% of our gross cultivated area could be under organic farming, which would mean lower methane emissions and lower greenhouse gas emissions. Fifth, I've talked about buildings, again, very important for greenhouse gas emissions. And I've said that by 2011, we will have mandatory building codes which are going to be green compliant. And finally, I've said that by the year 2020 or 2030, we will sequester 15 to 20% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions through our forests. Now, these are some illustrative examples I've given you, 5 or 6 voluntary mitigation commitments that we are now considering as part of a domestic agenda. We are now planning to introduce a legislation in the forthcoming session of Parliament. There's discussion going on this. But this in no way changes the international context of what we are doing. So we are following a twin-track approach. Originally, we were following a one-track approach of international negotiations. And what we are saying now is that, look, we need to be seen to be constructive. The atmospherics of India's position also has to change, even though India has nothing to feel apologetic or defensive about. And in order to do this, and also in order to convey a message to our own people that climate change is very much dealing with climate change is very much in our interest. And like in the United States, in India, no international agreement can be entered into without a durable political consensus at home. And I believe that creating this legislative framework for taking on voluntary greenhouse gas mitigation cuts is an important step forward in creating this legislative consensus. So, in summary, I would say India's road to Copenhagen. One road to Copenhagen is the international road, which is the road of negotiations, the road of give and take. But the other important road is the domestic road, full of potholes, no doubt, but very important in order to ensure that we are able to be successful on the international track. Now, the big question that the Danish Prime Minister asked me last week when he was in Delhi, can you convert your domestic responsibilities to international commitments? I said no. We are not in a position to do that because the prerequisites for India taking on international commitments have not been fulfilled. And I have repeated this to all of you time and time again what these prerequisites are. Until those prerequisites are fulfilled, India cannot convert its voluntary, unilateral, domestic actions into international commitments. The other question that is asked is, but who will monitor? Will you subject your domestic actions to monitoring, reporting and verification? And my answer to that is, we don't need any international monitoring, reporting and verification in India. Whatever the government does is subject to daily monitoring, reporting and verification in our country. We have enough of a civil society organization. We have a boisterous media. We have a competitive political system. We have new laws on right to information. No government can afford or can pull the wool over people's eyes on the fulfillment of their mitigation cuts in this case. So we are accountable domestically. We will carry forward this legislative agenda on mitigation cuts, whether there is Copenhagen or not. This is not Copenhagen dependent. We will do this mitigation cut in a legislative framework as part of our own action, but we will continue to engage the world on a Copenhagen agreement, and I believe a modest but an important agreement is possible at Copenhagen based on the three areas that I have identified. It may be premature to talk about a grand deal at Copenhagen, but it's better to have a good deal at Copenhagen and then work to the grand deal rather than to shoot for a grand deal and come a cropper there. So I think I'll stop here and then maybe take more questions now.
Thank you very much. It was Now we can take questions from the floor.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Yeah. Could you just say who you are? I know.
Well,
This works, sir.
when Mrs. Clinton came to India, actually the meeting with Mrs. Clinton was very, very pleasant. Unfortunately, the reporting on that visit was quite contrary to the actual content of the meeting. But what came out of the meeting was, something entirely different. But demand number one is that India and China should take on binding targets. That's the demand number one. That countries like India and China should take on legally binding targets.
Beginning when?
Sorry?
Beginning when?
1990.
Well, we can discuss that, but the concept of a target you should accept. You should accept a target. All right. Then there is demand number two. If you find the target is difficult for you, then you must take a cap. This is the second demand. Okay, if a cap is difficult for you, you have to indicate a peaking year. Will you peak by 2030? Will you peak by 2040? Will you peak by 2050? I'm giving you the variations on a demand, So the third demand is indicate a cap. A fourth demand is, some countries have actually come up with this proposal, Australia amongst them, is follow the WTO approach. Make your actions, be accountable for your actions, not for targets. That you commit to a portfolio of actions. You deposit that portfolio with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, like you do under, the Global Agreement on Trade and Services. And you subject that to international monitoring. So these are different types of demands that are coming on countries like India and China. But I must say that although India and China are in the same negotiating ship, we are negotiating together. I myself was in China 2 weeks ago. We have good understanding and cooperation in negotiating forums. On the negotiating ship, we are together. But on the greenhouse gas ship, we can't be in the same ship. Because they are way, way ahead of us. As I said, China is 23% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and we are less than 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And to expect that India will do what China has to do is, I think, being grossly unfair on India.
Yes?
Vijay Modi, by the way, we went to Hawaii together 32 years ago. Question is slightly different. As we are making this voluntary commitments and putting real money behind it, how can we align the innovation, manufacturing, venture capital, all that towards a longer term building of industry along these lines in India?
Well, let me say that one of the features of what I have presented to you is that I am not waiting for international finance or international technology to do all the things that I have told you that we should be doing. We will do it on our own. But we see an important area for technology cooperation and financial flows. But I'm realistic enough to know that in today's environment, we are not going to be able to get financial flows of the level that is required. And I'm also realistic enough to know that technology never gets transferred. Because there are so many other issues associated with technology, IPR issues, and so on and so forth. So we have to make, as you said, a very substantial investment in our own capacity to deal with these issues. And then negotiate with the world from a position of strength. I think India has the potential to be a leader in many of these areas. We are the world's leader in fast breeder technology. Today, India is the only country in the world where fast breeder reactors are being put on the ground on a commercial scale. And 5 years from now, when we have fast breeder nuclear reactors, the world will look at India differently. We are already a major player in the wind energy field. We have 8,000 megawatts of wind capacity on the ground. And one of our Indian companies, although it's been getting a lot of bad press in the US nowadays, is top 4 or top 5 of the world companies. I think in solar, we have not made the type of investment that we should have made. But in solar energy, we have the capacity, the research and the innovation capacity to emerge as world leaders. And in clean coal as well, we have this huge research infrastructure which has really not been put into service with well-defined commercial objectives. So I think one of the big challenges in India is to convert the very extensive research and institutional capacity that we have to actually get into the manufacturing and innovation cycle. And it is important to do this on our own. And let me give you 2 examples of why I believe it's important for countries like India to invest in their own capacity. Now, I'm a great believer in engagement with the world, but I think we should engage from a position of strength and not necessarily from a position of subservience. In 1990, the US government put out a report that India's emissions of methane from agriculture was 38 million tons per year. The US Environmental Protection Agency put out a report that methane from India's paddy cultivation is a major contributor to methane buildup in the world. I happened to be in the Prime Minister's office and I was aghast when I saw this report. I said, this can't be true. So what we did, we created a small team of scientists and we said, our present Prime Minister was the Finance Minister. I went to him and I said, sir, we require some money. He said, why? I said, look, this is this absurd report that's come from the US that says that 38 million tons of methane is put into the atmosphere every year by our agriculture, leave alone our livestock. We have to counter this. I don't believe this is true. So we put together a team. They monitored the methane emissions for 4 years. And today, the very same US government accepts a number between 3 to 6 million tons per year as methane contributions from Indian agriculture. The same US Environmental Protection Agency that was giving us 38 million tons, today if you go and ask what is methane emission from Indian agriculture, they will tell you it's 4 to 5 million tons per year. Take the Himalayan glaciers as another example. Today you can't see any program on television without epitaphs being written about the Himalayan glaciers. That by 2030 Himalayan glaciers will cease to exist. But the truth is much more complex than this. Some glaciers are receding. Some glaciers are advancing. In some glaciers, the rate of retreat has actually come down over the last 30 years. It's a serious issue. I'm not denying or minimizing the danger to the Himalayan glaciers. But the Himalayan glaciers are not like the Arctic glaciers. They're basically fundamentally different. Now, unless we have our own capacity to see what is happening, study these trends, put out the research studies, I think we'll always be in a dependent mode. And many times, the information that gets put out, I'm afraid, is not supported by robust scientific evidence.
The basic approach, that the same principle, that even at the most aggressive annual economic growth, India's per capita emission would be well below. And the second point, you make really a good point, that without pretty large-scale commitments from developed countries, global agreements on greenhouse gas emissions are quite meaningless. Then the question arises, why is India going ahead with domestic voluntary greenhouse gas emission kind of processes, and why not focus on making, as you said, for example, the farming livelihoods more resilient? Here, I'm not suggesting it has to be trade-off, zero-sum, but why are you doing this? Is it only for moral high ground, so that then India is not seen as this kind of the major stumbling block, or is it something else? Given that whatever India does, as you said, is not going to make a big dent in the global greenhouse gas portfolio. Thank you.
Well, this is a question that's often asked, why are you doing this? And, one can say that the cynical view could be, you're trying to change the global, to use a language which somebody said, you're trying to recapture the narrative for India. That's a colorful way of saying it. But I would like to think, as I said, and I seriously believe in what I mean when I say this, that climate change is of paramount importance to us, because we have evidence that climate change is beginning to already impact many areas of our economy. Take agriculture, for example. 4 years ago, I wrote a report which showed that stagnation in wheat yields in North India. One of the reasons why wheat yields are stagnating is because the mean temperatures in the critical months of February and March have gone up in the last 10 to 15 years. And I've already talked about the frequency of extreme events, the frequency of drought or the frequency of excess rainfall. So I think, for us to say that we'll be worried about climate change only if we have a good agreement in Copenhagen, that's being very irresponsible. I think we should be ahead of the world on climate change, because more than most countries, we are vulnerable to its vagaries. We don't know, but we don't have to wait for perfect knowledge. We are making some rough probabilistic calculations that mean sea levels will go up and rainfall patterns will change and glaciers will retreat. So I think we need to do that interventions for our own good. And if it helps to establish ourselves as responsible global citizens, that's a co-benefit. But the primary benefit is domestic. The primary benefit is to create a larger constituency of political support which will enable India at some stage to take on a meaningful international role. And we don't have to be a major emitter in order to be a major demander of an agreement. I think, there's a fundamental conceptual point here, because many people in India say, why are you so aggressive on climate change agreement? We're not a major polluter anyway. I don't think that's the case. I think we need, if we are going to be a global player, if we have aspirations of sitting in the Security Council, which we have, if we have aspirations of being part of G3, G4 or any one of these various G combinations, then we have to have this type of a vision. And I think on climate change we need to demonstrate this vision. And let me tell you, this is one issue on which the Prime Minister has really from day one, the first thing he told me was, be part of the solution. From day one he's been saying this. He says, be part of the solution, think differently, think differently. Yeah, the appetite for CDM is now declining, because China and India have been the two biggest beneficiaries of CDM, and they feel that China and India have walked away, with all the goodies in terms of the technology, in terms of the money. And many countries are actually asking, why should we continue with the CDM? But it's in the nature of any international agreement that India and China will be the biggest beneficiaries. I mean, you take the most successful international environmental agreement, which incidentally has some lessons for Copenhagen, the Montreal Protocol. And people don't talk about the Montreal Protocol, but the Montreal Protocol is very significant. This is for the depletion of the phase out of the ozone depleting substances. Now, how did the Montreal Protocol become so successful? It became successful because you had a protocol which everybody subscribed to, and you had a fund that was created, a $2.5 billion fund that was created, largely by contributions from the developed world. This fund was then distributed to the developing countries, and it so happened that technology was also shared. DuPont was the original technology provider and also the alternative technology provider, and technology access was provided to DuPont. And today the world it's a success story. We have, as an example, India has phased out ozone depleting substances 17 months ahead of schedule. But even in the Montreal Protocol, we walked away with $300 million and China has probably walked away with $400 million. So if you're 40% of the world's population, you have to walk away with 40% of any fund that is created. So
that's but actually, if I may just add something to what she was saying.
Ajit, can I have a little water, please?
Yeah, I think, why don't you...
Sorry.
Someone reach out. Okay. To say that the CDM is actually, has been shoveling money into India and China, they're the beneficiaries, but actually it's people here are evading their own obligations to do something inside the system. So again, to have us portrayed as being the beneficiaries, I mean, it's the guys here who
I know.
are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a...
so, I mean, it's a
but
two-sided thing.
there is this argument. She's right,
Yeah.
She's right, because today the CDM lobby is not very, very strong. And the argument is that, why are we creating competition in China and India? Now this argument is being given, and we should not extend the CDM.
Merit?
Yes, ma'am.
Louder.
I have a question
Maybe.
in ignorance, but if the developed countries were willing to make significant commitments along the lines you've suggested, that you think are significant, but they wish to embody them in the formalities that you are proposing for India, that is to say, through unilateral voluntary measures, because actually, as you see, we don't have a regulatory framework. We have an evolving regulatory framework in the U.S. And coming from
fat will be really on the fire then. If the United States and the developed world were to agree to India's proposal to cut 40% by 2020 with 1990 reference levels, I'll have to go back and rethink my entire strategy. But since that's unlikely to happen, I want to say wicket. But it's a difficult question. It's a difficult question to answer, really, honestly.
Wasn't this also Bush's approach? I mean, with the major emitters and so on?
See,
Tom
Schelling, who will be speaking here on the 3rd of October, Tom Schelling has a very interesting proposal. When he had come to India, we had a discussion on that. Schelling's proposal is don't go for targets. He says the targets is the wrong way of going for Copenhagen. Go for the action approach. I mean, let every country commit itself to a portfolio of actions and create a system by which you do. Now, in a sense, what I'm suggesting to you is is taking the Schelling idea. I'm not committing India to an explicit target, but I'm taking on a series of implicit targets. By introducing mandatory fuel efficiency standards, by having more renewable energy, by having mandatory building codes. All this is implicitly reducing the emissions of CO2. But I'm not quantifying it, So what Schelling says is the quantification process becomes contentious, a lot of dispute. So let every country actually come up with a portfolio of actions. And frankly, let me tell you, of all the proposals that I have seen on the international agenda, obviously, other than the Superfund proposal of our host today, the plug for you. Other than that proposal...
If you say it as a minister, I will...
No, I find the Schelling idea quite persuasive, actually. I find it far more persuasive than the target approach when we are arguing about whether it's 15%, whether it's 1990 reference level, whether it's 2005 reference level. Then it gets away from that whole dispute arena. And what he says is that you come up with credible actions and you create a system for monitoring. Am I right? That's what essentially is.
We see that in trade negotiations also. Like once you start quantifying with all these absurdly, absurd GCG, but general equilibrium models, then people begins to sort of worry about the exact numbers and so on. It's probably better to get away.
Actually, Mike Spence had a very good presentation in India.
Who?
Mike Spence.
Yeah.
He had also, broadly, Mike Spence also was following. But what I find very sad is that the intellectual, in fact, when I was chairing Professor Spence's lecture, and I said, you should be lecturing in the United States, not in India. Because you need to create this consensus in your own country, not in India. What I find is this complete disconnect between the debate on climate change in the media and in the political system in the US and the debate in the intellectual world. If you look at all the proposals, I was just telling Jagdish, I've done an analysis of all these proposals. I got one of my young aides to do it. And it's quite remarkable. There's so much of new thinking that is available on the table today, but somehow it's not part of the negotiating process. It's not part of the UN process or the G20 process or the G8 process. But there we have become prisoners of numbers. We've become prisoners of targets. We've become prisoners of history. I think frankly, I find the Superfund idea. I find the stock flow distinction a very important distinction, which needs to be made. I also find the Schelling idea very, very attractive. But I don't think it's going to go far, frankly, because we have become part of that system.
But it's amazing, Jairam. We know from Indian thinking. I mean, when we started writing about reforms, people like us, there was not a prayer, not a hope.
Yeah.
And yet 25 years later, it was a new policy. So,
but with all this intellectual firepower, the U.S. position does not reflect, or the U.S. interlocutors do not reflect the diversity of approaches that is being suggested. I think that's the important thing, that diversity if an agreement can build a diversity of approaches, it has a greater chance of acceptance than to build a unifocal, target-oriented approach. And this is what, when the Danish Prime Minister had come, I said, But it's difficult for the governments to allow for diversity. With Mrs. Clinton also I had argued. I said, Madam Secretary, just allow for a variety of approaches, I don't know whether ultimately they will actually get around to doing it or not. Frankly, the reading on the wall is not very, very positive, because I think it's the target, take it or leave it, cap, peaking here, these are standard formula that is available.
One last question, I think, because we should then break up.
It's like you mentioned on the three low-hanging fruits, to plot for the success of Copenhagen. What really happens if we don't plug that? That's number one.
If we don't have an agreement?
Those fruits.
If you don't plug... If you don't have any, if you don't have an agreement in Copenhagen, we probably will go back to Copenhagen a couple of months later. I mean, no, really. I mean, that's what we do in trade. We do it in trade. Trade talks failed. We came back, and then Professor Bhagwati writes in Financial Times, and all these things. So I think, I don't want to sound very negative, but if we don't have an agreement in Copenhagen, the world is not going to come to a standstill. I think we can use that dynamic and take the discussion forward. I think we should work to a realistic agreement. The expectations are so great among civil society organizations. The expectations are so great in the media particularly. I think one needs to bring a certain degree of realism into what can be achieved. But the question that you raise is important. What if there is no agreement in Copenhagen? What if? I mean, we just have 14 days of, discussion and nothing happens. I think what we'll probably do is that there'll be a chairman's summary that will be circulated, and then we'll agree to meet again,
You will have emitted more carbon because of all the people flying and so on. So we'll have made a contribution by creating more disorder. Sridhar, literally last question.
Two of the most important issues, apart from terrorism, also issue of climate change, rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to the merits and demerits of that. India has been perceived to some extent as a stumbling block in Doha round of negotiations. Something rightly or wrongly for certain merits. It is very encouraging to hear that you want to be part of the solution. But I must say, as a layman, you're not a person, I'm not expressed, not a person of climate change, forum, etc. There's very little media or publicity coverage on India's position, as you explained, seems to be somewhat reasonable. Okay. In no way, see, if you look at targets and quantitative terms, you said you want to develop more like US and European Union, so reduce by 40%. So if you want to have the US produce your per capita 30 tons to by 40%, it's about 8, 12. And by the same time, you say, look, I should be allowed to go by 2020 to 3.5, which is increased by 75%. The world is going to see it in a percentage, say, it's not going to work. So as you said, it's got to be kind of a leadership from Jairam, people like you, who must be able to influence without authority on the leadership like US and European Union. Otherwise, we can sit here at Copenhagen 10, like everybody sitting on the rounds even now.
No, it's true that unfortunately both on Doha and on climate change we are considered to be, the world requires a punching bag. India is a good punching bag. We talk English well, we negotiate well, we put square brackets, round brackets, footnotes. Sorry, Manjeev, with due apologies. We are very good negotiators, and the Chinese use us. That's why in all international conferences, Chinese and the Indians get along famously, because China uses Indian eloquence and recalcitrance to get what it wants,
Outsource it.
They outsource it in negotiations. Yeah, it's true. It's unfortunate though, because I can tell you, even on Doha, the issues on agriculture. I have a slight disagreement with the guru here, because the world of political economy is quite different when it comes to agriculture, And ever since, before I joined politics, I would certainly agree with what Jagdish said. But after I became, an important member of the party, it's very difficult to justify many of the demands that are being made on agriculture. On climate change, I've already told you. I think the notion that we are a stumbling block is very largely exaggerated. Very largely exaggerated. But we're not good in PR. We don't explain our position, and I don't think that we do things on a scale that dramatically transform. Today you can't open a magazine in the world or a newspaper in the world which does not talk about how China is going to be the next renewable energy power in the world, all the wind energy and all the solar energy and all. The way the Chinese are able to simply overwhelm all of us by the sheer scale of what they do. I think the scale of what they do is very, very important, and scale in India is still on a much smaller level. Also, I think the ability of the Indian system to deliver on what it says is still somewhat suspect. We take on things and we're not able to do the things that we say that we would be able to do. Although our track record on international agreements is very good. That I must tell you. This is another point that I didn't say, but whenever we have taken on an international agreement, we have never reneged on any international agreement. We have not, he will bear me out much better than all of us, that on the international agreement scene record, India's track record has been truly outstanding. But in spite of that, this impression persists. And one of the reasons why I've come to New York here is basically to engage with my counterparts in various constituencies here. Next week, in fact, I'll go back to India, then come back again next week to the US to go to Washington and talk about what we are doing. I put out, it's on our website. You can just go onto our website, you'll find all this. You know what? Yeah, the media, unfortunately, is you got to do something about this, my friend. The media is, we have lost the media battle. I'm afraid the media is completely, just painted us as the single biggest, monster that is holding back a good agreement in Copenhagen. We got to do something on the media. But I can tell you, many of the things that we are doing, they will have medium-term and longer-term implications, and they will give us a strength that goes beyond the climate change debate. I think that's what I am trying to accomplish by all these unilateral measures. That what we need to do is to give for India a position in international scene, not just on the climate change issue, but on a larger canvas. Improve our bargaining position. I mean, that's the real issue.
Well, thank you very much. And Arvind will just say a few words of thanks to you.
Jagdish insisted that I thank the minister, and it is my indeed great pleasure. This talk and the minister is a good example of what happens when you put an IIT graduate to be the minister, and is a good argument for the Prime Minister to appoint more of him.
Not a good argument. Let me tell you, there's one IIT graduate who has been a cabinet minister in all governments in the last 15 years.
Who is?
In BP Singh's government, in Chandrasekhar's government, in BJP government, in Congress government, Ajit Singh.
Oh. Well, there are always some exceptions to prove the rule, Jairam.
He's so committed to nation building.
There are always some exceptions that prove the rule. No? So I stand by what I said. So in any case, let's give the minister another big hand for a